yeah, you giving your side of it, and then Simon give yours. Sorry, there's yeah, please, if that's okay.
It's a very interesting question when we talk about what psychedelics are. I mean, we talk about what they do, perhaps, is a thing. Um, so just to kind of give a bit more kind of brief context in terms of like where I'm coming from into this discussion, because I think one of the things that psychedelics are about is kind of like self-reflection. So I come at this whole sort of subject as someone who's an occultist, so someone who's interested in all the weird things, you know, copper bracelets, rheumatism, the Surrey Panther, the Loch Ness Monster, UFOs, all of that. And I suppose I became interested in psychedelics and psychoactive substances generally by engaging with the work of a lot of kind of contemporary occultists, notably the work of a dude called Aleister Crowley. And of course, Crowley is kind of famous as this sort of bad boy occultist, but he was also a very interesting character in as much as he put on the first ever kind of public performance, ritual performance, we might call it, in the form of giving mescaline to a group of people at Caxton Hall in about, I think, 1910, something like this. So he was someone experimenting with the use of psychedelics, and specifically in his case, mescaline. So I kind of come at this kind of subject from the perspective of somebody who's a kind of an esoteric practitioner. And so I suppose, given that, and given the fact that I'm a fully paid up member of, you know, Euro-American 21st century culture, for me, when I talk about psychedelics, there are a number of registers that we can speak in. We can speak about these things as a collection of interesting kind of molecules that do things to neurotransmitters and change, particularly the kind of, you know, serotonin system in the brain as being one of the primary kind of sites of operation of these things. Classic psychedelics, certainly. We can also talk about them as being kind of cultural artifacts. So we can talk about them as being these kind of contested fields of meaning, which I guess the question about, you know, are they schizotoxins? Are they these things? You know, talks about. We can talk about them perhaps even as spirits. That is to say, kind of entities or beings, whether or not they exist in a kind of Jungian archetypal sense, or their emergent properties of the interactions between chemistry and our minds and our kind of heritage as the sort of simian creatures that we are. We can talk about them in those kinds of ways. So the interesting thing about psychedelics is thinking about the kind of multiplicity of the ways we can understand them. And one of the things for me that I find really interesting about psychedelics is that they are often, in my experience, about this kind of multiplicity. So are they schizotoxins? I mean, I would defer to my more learned colleagues about, you know, the definition of these kind of terms. I'm not quite sure about that. Are they psychotomimetic? Do they give us a glimpse of what it is to be, in some sense, mad? Perhaps, maybe. Are they things that are agents of pleasure, things that we might use to enjoy ourselves, something that's incredibly hard for people to countenance in kind of post-Protestant culture, the idea that enjoying yourself might be okay. So potentially, yes, we know that. Britain, for example, consumes very large amounts of MDMA every year, probably less over the course of the last couple of years, I would imagine, but possibly more weed, I don't know. So these are substances that we might find enjoyment in. Are they substances that we can find therapeutic results from? The answer to that is it would seem to be undoubtedly yes. There are, it would seem, a number of situations or a number of psychological kind of difficulties that people find themselves in, that to some extent we all find ourselves in. Things like trauma, anxiety, depression. You know, if you're not feeling anxiety and depression at this point in the 21st century, you're probably not really paying attention. So are there things that can help us with that? Yes. If I had to say one thing about them, I would say that they are substances which give us the opportunity to learn. That's one of the things that I'm particularly kind of interested in. So my academic background is in kind of teaching and learning theory, and I see a lot of what the potential psychedelics, including the subset of their medical use, being about opportunities to learn things, to re-understand things in new ways. And we can look at that as being to do with the neurology, and we can look at this in kind of notions of neuroplasticity and these kinds of things, new neuronal connections and so on being formed. We can think of this subjectively in terms of these are new ideas, these are new metaphors that we encounter. And perhaps we can think of these in a kind of global sense as well, that the presence on our planet of these very interesting materials that allow us to learn, and often to learn in a kind of a way that's sort of socially mediated. It's very important, I think, to understand that a lot of the kind of the learning that goes on with psychedelics is often to do with, for example, in the therapeutic context, our relationships with each other and our relationships with our own sort of internalized kind of trauma. So they're very relational. And so, yeah, that's a couple of things to get us started. I don't know if that's what we wanted, Alex, but that's what I've said.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, it's a very good way of framing it. I think it's interesting, given that the term psychedelic really only began, what was it, 52, coined by Humphrey Osmond, and that before there were these earlier terms, psychomimesis, and it seemed like the closest thing, as you kind of pointed out, for a lot of people's understanding at the time, to be able to, the closest kind of metaphor to understand it through was madness and mental illness, and a lot of people modeling early understandings of LSD off that of alcohol delirium, which seems to be very different, really, in terms of what I've read. But nevertheless, maybe I'm rambling here, but in my eyes, I think that could perhaps be reflective of the limited scope in which we perhaps viewed the mind in general at the time. There was a lot of this kind of behaviorism in the 50s, viewing the mind purely through this kind of outward measurable functions. And when it comes to something as complex and introspective as a psychedelic trip, perhaps science at least fell short there at the time. But yeah, I guess I'm going to pass on to Simon now, who could talk a bit about the question. Is that we had 20 minutes past? Oh no, we've only 12 minutes. Sorry. Continue, Julian.
Well, Simon's welcome to come in if he likes.
Yeah, Simon, you're able to come.
Yeah. Simon, say a thing.
Yeah,
I'll say a thing. Yeah, it's interesting. So when I give my talk, you'll see that it's coming at it from a very different angle, which I think is the beauty of the subject of psychedelics and with medicine. And I don't know, I don't necessarily feel like a fraud, but again, you'll see in my talk, I have lots of graphs and I'm showing that there are ayahuasca showing decreases in depression. I hope I'm not kind of ruining the punchline for anyone, but there's always a part of me that feels, I don't know, that's one thing that psychedelics can do. But there are so many other things that, like, especially, so ayahuasca is my area of specialty. So many other things that it can do. And yeah, I don't think that any one part, any lens through which you view it is any more or less important than the others. And I was really happy that Julian brought up this idea of play and of fun, because I think we kind of, especially with the lab-based studies, we forget that, psychedelics can be lots of fun. And even in ayahuasca ceremonies, so people who have drunk ayahuasca, you can get dragged to hell and back for sure, and you definitely shouldn't take it lightly, but they can also be loads of fun, which is really important. Therapy and treatment, I think, is at its best when it's fun. You can get that in psychotherapy, and I'm glad to see that we're coming at it from that angle as well.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a really good perspective, and there's a lot, I think, about the medical usage now, which to me almost, I mean, there's a lot to be said about the validities and benefits of its medicinal use, but I think there's a lot to be said also about how, I've just been asked something. There's a lot to be said how, that shouldn't really be a pretense for justification of use as well. I think that this perhaps is the framework implies that perhaps there's kind of to have a trip because you simply enjoy it is somehow less valuable. And I think that's true. And I think for me, some of the biggest medical benefits came kind of unintentionally. I think it's an interesting thing is that often, it's not necessarily that for a lot of people who go and take mushrooms for this particular, for depression or for anxiety and then get a benefit. I think often the people who come in just because they're interested or they're excited or they just kind of want to enjoy themselves a bit can still reap those medical benefits, even if it's not under that pretense. But yeah, Julian,
Can I just kind of just riff off that a little bit, if I may? Which is just to talk about how I think one of the things David King did a fantastic presentation, which I think people can probably find online, about the experience of pulling back the curtains in the morning and realizing that it snowed overnight. And he does this brilliant rap where he kind of basically says, like, you know, before you start to think about how annoying it's going to be to get to work and all that sort of stuff, one of the things most of us experience, many of us experience, is that we open the curtains and we go, wow, the world is transformed. Now that experience of wow, the world is transformed, it seems to me is hugely beneficial for all of us. When we are also locked into and I know that the language gets overused about default mode network states and whatever, but when we are basically in a rut, let's say, the very fact that we can see the world transformed and we can recognize our capacity for that to be possible, it's still a function of our neurology, that even though we've got this trauma, we've taken the MDMA and we're able to find the downregulation of the fear response, and there's that moment of opening the curtains and everything's different. And I think that experience is a valuable and beneficial experience for many people, and that can, of course, occur as part of a kind of medical intervention to assist with that person and the trauma or whatever that they're working with. But also, I think it works for most of us most of the time. So the two things that, you know, when I work with people in connection with psychedelics, that I'll tell them is, I say, well, in my experience, there's only two things that are more or less guaranteed. So one thing that that seems to be very common for most people is that you have a sense that in the experience, you've been able to see the world in a different way. Now, that different way may be equally as difficult, or it may involve, you know, we talk about things like ayahuasca and various other things doing the work. It can be a very kind of powerful and potentially difficult journey that requires all those kind of, you know, really good strategies for kind of integration, making sense of things kind of afterwards. But you will see the world in a different way. If nothing else, you'll notice how the ceiling is breathing, you know, whatever, some throwaway kind of thing like that. Fantastic. So you'll see things differently. The second thing that happens is that people, again, in my experience, almost always come away from the thing with a sense that they have more capacity. And I like that kind of way of framing it. So it's like they're like a cup, you know, they have more space in their cup. And what a lot of people say is there, and then, you know, again, it's always interesting, I think, to look at the kind of metaphors that we use to describe these things. A very good metaphor for many of us modern people is to talk about the defragmentation of a hard drive. So people say it's like having the brain defragged, like all the stuff is still there, including potentially the trauma or the difficulties that I'm having. But all the files have been kind of shuffled around, so there's a little bit more space. There's a bit more kind of room for within let's call it, you know, the working memory. And I think that kind of experience is inherently valuable given the nature of the human condition, right? So I don't necessarily subscribe all the way to Buddhism. I mean, it's, you know, got some great ideas, but you know, bless him for a rich kid with an eating disorder. He did know a thing or two about philosophy, did Gautama Buddha, and that idea that, you know, the first noble truth, all the world is suffering, again, arguably a problematic translation, but nevertheless, we as human beings experience suffering, loss, understanding of our own mortality, and so on. And I think that what can happen to us, particularly when we're in difficult social settings, here we are in a global pandemic, is that we can kind of collapse in ourselves. We can find ourselves stuck in those ruts. And so to be able to open the curtains and see the world transformed is really beneficial for us. And if it's beneficial for us, it is likely beneficial for all the people we will ever be in contact with, ever. Yeah, so I do bits of work for the NHS doing kind of well-being stuff. And I often say to people who are doing these practices, thank you for doing that, because you're helping you and you're also helping everybody else on the planet by dint of you cultivating your own well-being. You know, that's part of how this thing operates. And I think it's very interesting looking at the kind of the way that let's call it liberalization of some of the legislation over psychedelic substances has come into our cultures, you know, as Terence McKenna would say, not a moment too soon, is that it's come primarily through things like the medical discourse. So with the changes with the law with regard to cannabis, for instance, we started off with, if you have some terrible, awful, painful condition or some repeated seizures that you're experiencing, or perhaps later on some kind of psychological trauma, then you can smoke cannabis. And that gradually, we've kind of pulled culture, not unfortunately here in the British Isles, but in other parts of the planet, towards the idea that the experience of joy and of pleasure and of, you know, is a good thing. And of course, we all tend to sort of think, oh, joy and pleasure, and then immediately we sort of think, what about addiction? What about sort of the kind of problematic behaviors or abusive behaviors or self-damaging behaviors? Those things are, of course, there as well. But nevertheless, the notion that to experience bliss, delight, the connectivity and relationship that people find, you know, on the dance floor with MDMA, those things are good human needs that need to be served. And psychedelics are one mechanism whereby those things can be found, that joy can be found, that moment of opening the curtains and seeing the world transformed, and often transformed in this magical and delightful and beautiful way. I've stopped now.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think it's a really, really good point. And it's interesting, this whole that when the medical paradigm is a bit more firm, it's really this whole idea that, well, you can have cannabis if you're dying. And this is a very surreal sort of approach. I mean, I don't know why one would have to justify a certain amount of suffering to recognize it as a positive thing. And medicine is a very complicated term. And I think what might be medicinal for others, as in just kind of a lift in mood or a kind of concreting of perspective or forward thinking vision, might be for someone else actually helping with an anxiety or an illness. But it could be medical in a very broad sense, I think, and just in the sense that it's beneficial and it brings happiness. And yeah, I think there's a lot about some kind of puritanism. I'm not sure exactly where you ground it in, of just that you can't really admit that you enjoy it, that it's fun, and there's a real hatred against that sort of approach. And I think that's really interesting, except with few substances such as alcohol and tobacco, which seem to be some of the most depressing. It was kind of interesting, depending on who you ask, of course, each to their own. But yeah, I guess I'll bring in Simon now, if that sounds good. Great.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you want me to go ahead and give the presentation, Alex?
Yeah, if that's okay.
Yeah, cool. Sorry, bear with me one sec.
But someone's made just a point, Luke has made a point about decriminalization of cannabis in Durham. It's complicated. I guess with the UK being kind of quasi-unitary system, it's still very much illegal in places, and there are people in Durham who are still arrested for it. I think that the decriminalization, a lot of it in Durham stems from austerity as well. I don't think it's necessarily grounded just as this kind of health thing. It's because they don't have the resources for it, which to me is, I feel like, out of all the reasons as to actually be more lenient on drug use, that's not one of them. It shouldn't be the complete defunding. But yeah, I mean, it's interesting how there is a variety of opinions in the UK. Anyway, sorry, Simon, if you found it, I didn't want to go on, but I just want to respond to that quickly.
Yeah, sorry, and I'm just having some technical issues.
Yeah, no worries. Just let me know when you found.
Yeah, do you want to keep talking amongst yourselves, and then I'll.
I'm fine at that. I can keep on talking. That's yeah. So in regards to cannabis, it is interesting, right? So with the existence of UK cannabis clubs and all this stuff, there are increasingly these legitimate social spaces, or quite, well, not quite legitimate in the legal sense, where people still purchase and openly use it. And so something seems to be changing here in the UK. I don't know exactly, but it's all done in a very unofficial sort of way. And I don't know if maybe it's just going to get to the point whereby it's almost practically legal anyway, even though it isn't, before the UK government actually says, well, you know what, we might as well now. But yeah, we'll have to see. We can only hope. But yeah. Does anyone have something to add to that? I don't want to just.
I just wanted to add that,
Yeah,
you know, I've got friends on the ground who are medical practitioners, nurse practitioners, and so on. And despite the alleged change in legislation, it's still incredibly hard for people outside of private medicine to find themselves prescribed a cannabis-based medicine, or indeed cannabis as a herb itself. You know, I know people who are trying to do this, and I know various kind of organizations that are trying to support them. But what happens in theory and what happens in practice, unfortunately, are often quite different things.
Absolutely, yeah. And there doesn't seem to be the same level of availability or quality control under the medical framework. I've heard a lot of people getting really bad quality weed or even moldy weed from medical private companies. I think that's really interesting. Often it seems to be, anyway, sorry, Simon, it seems like you've found it now. So I'll let you get started on that.
Oh yeah, my computer seems to be not liking the slides. If it doesn't load, then next time I try it, I'll just do it without. That's fine.
Sure.
Well, it would be nice to show you guys this.
Well, yeah, I'll just, in regards to that last point, I mean, it's interesting. I think, again, it relates, I think, in some loose way to this notion of enjoyment not being kind of an inherently bad thing. There's a very interesting period of, I think until very recently, the DEA had a rule that any cannabis used in scientific studies in the US had to be of a really low grade quality, had to be a specific kind of, and that to me is fascinating that they were so willingly, in my opinion, willingly in denial of its benefits, that they actually want to make it worse, so as to kind of deflate any sort of positive research outcomes. I think that's actually changed now, but only recently. But yeah, it's fascinating looking at how there are these sort of, as I said, cannabis clubs. They're not legal, but they're huge now. And I mean, there's all these events in Durham 420, where it's, and I think Hyde Park as well, where it's openly being sold. And that to me is just fascinating, just from a sociological perspective. But anyway, enough about cannabis. It looks like you found the slide. So
cool. Yeah, sorry about that, guys. Can you see that?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Brilliant. So, yep. So, like Alex said, I'm a psychiatrist and also a researcher. I used to be based at King's, but interestingly now I'm actually based in Melbourne, and I've been doing research into ayahuasca over the last 6-7 years, primarily based in the Amazon rainforest. We're actually starting to do studies in a lab-based setting, so I'm going to tell you about that and what that could mean for medicine. Okay, so we'll do a quick overview of the basics of ayahuasca before looking at the research that we've been doing in the Amazon rainforest and also ethics associated with that. And then I want to tell you a bit about what we're starting to do towards the medicalization of ayahuasca, and obviously huge ethical issues to discuss and what that actually means for ayahuasca as a medicine. So a quick overview, I'm sure many of you already know, but very simply put, ayahuasca is a psychedelic plant brew. It's a mix of two different things. And so you have the ayahuasca vine, which is called the Banisteriopsis caapi vine, which contains some chemicals called beta-carbolines. And then you have, it's normally mixed with the leaves of something called Psychotria viridis, but it can be some different leaves, and they contain the potent psychedelic DMT or dimethyltryptamine. So if you were to normally consume or ingest these leaves, there wouldn't be much of an effect, but actually the enzymes that are in the ayahuasca vine, the beta-carbolines, amongst other things, prevent the breakdown of DMT. And so it gets absorbed into the bloodstream and you get the psychedelic effects that you can experience with ayahuasca. It literally translates as the vine or the rope of the dead. And when people consume ayahuasca, they typically describe having big changes in their sensory perception. So that's being able to see things that other people can't see or hear, and maybe even changes in their cognition, so thinking about things differently. People can see things from outside of the box, from a different perspective, kind of like what Julian was saying before, seeing things from, opening the curtains and seeing the new snowy world outside. Maybe even reliving old memories from their childhood, and seeing them from a different point of view. Ayahuasca is quite famous for being a purgative, so people can vomit or they can release diarrhea, but it's not just kind of bodily functions that get purged. People talk about a purge of emotions, so people can be crying, they can be letting things go. This can be through shivering, shaking, sweating. Lots of things can happen. Many people have an introspection when they drink ayahuasca, so they go into themselves and they're thinking about things. And for many people, they also believe that they can connect with the divine. So ayahuasca has many uses. What I'm primarily going to talk about is its use as a medicine, but it's also used as a sacrament and as a tool. Interestingly, in the past, it was used, still now, but slightly less commonly, it was used for hunting and for warfare. And now, in the last 10, 20 years, it's used for tourism and scientific inquiry, things like that. So just a little note on ayahuasca tourism. So ayahuasca has become a lot more popular since really the turn of the millennium. And it's now spread to every single continent in the world. And there's also lots of people who are going over to the Amazon rainforest in order to drink ayahuasca. And people have raised concerns about this, saying that it might be diluting the traditions. So like we mentioned before, ayahuasca was used historically more for things like warfare and for hunting. But there's this idea now that ayahuasca is all about love and healing, which of course it is. That is a big part of it, but it's created a demand where there isn't much of a role for things like sorcery, brujeria. And so it is changing the tradition due to ayahuasca tourism. People have also raised concerns about environmental stability. So that's not just people flying over to the Amazon rainforest, but it's the way in which the ayahuasca vine is harvested. So it takes about between 7 to 10 years for the vine to become mature, and people have raised concerns that it's not being harvested in a sustainable way. There are also some concerns regarding safety. So unfortunately, it's not uncommon now to hear of sexual abuse taking place in ayahuasca circles. And this has got to the point that there are actually some guidelines specifically aimed at kind of younger women, but not necessarily, in order to avoid sexual abuse in ceremony settings. There's also some risks to do with financial abuse, maybe even physical or psychological damage, if it's not taken appropriately, and if indeed you're not actually drinking ayahuasca, you're drinking something else that's been given under the name of ayahuasca. People have raised concerns that ayahuasca tourism might be leading to a commodification of ayahuasca. Could this be cultural appropriation and biopiracy, creating a market run by Westerners where locals are disadvantaged? But that being said, for many people, ayahuasca and ayahuasca tourism does provide healing and meaning, and also a sense of community. And some people have even suggested that it might help to promote and protect tradition as we move into a more modern world, as preventing these traditions from being lost, like was more like the case in the West and surrounding psilocybin mushrooms. Okay. So I'm just going to talk briefly about the first study that we did looking at the effects of ayahuasca on personality structure. So all of our research based in the Amazon rainforest has been looking at ayahuasca use in an adapted Shipibo framework. So that is, Shipibos is the tribe that we work with. And we work with experienced practitioners such as Don Rono, who you can see here on this slide. We have a retreat center and a research center that's based in the Mashana community, which is a community of about 80 indigenous individuals, about 2 hours away from Iquitos in the Peruvian Amazon. And there's no mains electricity or phone signal or internet here, so it's pretty disconnected. And the research center is called RIOSBO, and it's affiliated with MAPS, which is the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, as I'm sure many of you are aware of. So here we can see the location of the research center in the Peruvian Amazon. Okay. And so for this first study, we were looking at 24 participants, 9 of which were female. And we also had a comparison group of people who were traveling around South America but weren't drinking ayahuasca. And this was to control for something that we called the Mallorca effect, which was the idea that basically just going away might lead to changes in your personality and the way that you related to the world, even if you weren't drinking ayahuasca. So we assessed participants' personality immediately before their first ceremony, immediately following their second ceremony, immediately following their final ceremony, and 6 months later to look for longer-term changes. And the retreats lasted for 12 days. So there were 6 ayahuasca ceremonies, 1 every other day. We also conducted semi-structured interviews throughout the retreats, and this was to get more of a holistic idea of what was going on when people were drinking the brew. So this is the Mashana community. And this is our research and retreat center. Okay. So in order to assess personality, we used an inventory called the NEO-PI, which is basically a massive questionnaire of about 250 questions. And it's kind of the gold standard for assessing personality across the board. And it looks at personality in 5 different domains. So it looks at openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And together, these are known as the Big 5. And we also used the mystical experience questionnaire to assess for peak experiences real mystical experiences. And that's where the participants felt outside of a sense of time, whether they felt connected to God, whether they felt a sense of oceanic boundlessness and connection to everything around them. So we found that there were significant decreases in how neurotic participants were, both in the short term and 6 months later, compared to the control group. And we also found that there were significant increases in how agreeable participants were, both in the short term and again, 6 months later, when compared to the control group. Interestingly, we also found that the greater the degree of mystical experience, and so whether participants had what they thought was a very extreme or peak experience, the higher that was, the greater the decrease in how neurotic participants felt 6 months after drinking ayahuasca. Great, so I'm just going to tell you a bit about the last study that we've been doing in the jungle as well. So it's in the same setup, a very similar area. This one is actually particularly interesting because we got funding from the UK government, from the Medical Research Council to do this. And we were able to look at epigenetic changes as well as mental health changes. So that's actually the way in which DNA is expressed as a result of drinking ayahuasca. And it's the first time that anyone's ever looked at any psychedelic and epigenetic changes. So in this study, we had 65 participants, and we had a similar format. So we were testing participants immediately before their retreats, immediately afterwards, and then 6 months later. And here we were looking at depression, anxiety, self-compassion, general well-being. And then we had a specific focus on trauma. So we were looking at whether or not people's perception of trauma changed after drinking ayahuasca. So obviously the actual memories don't change, but how they related to them. And then we also wanted to look at whether or not the amount of trauma that people had experienced in childhood had any impact on their outcomes. Once again, we collected semi-structured interviews to get a more holistic idea of what had been going on. And we collected saliva samples before and after the retreats. And this was to look at the changes in DNA expression for the epigenetic analysis. So we found significant decreases, again, both immediately after drinking the ayahuasca, so finishing the retreat, in depression. And again, that was maintained 6 months later. And we found significant decreases in anxiety that was maintained 6 months later as well. We found improvements in self-compassion, again, both in the short term and the long term, and also decreases in global distress, both in the short and the long term. We also found that the way that participants perceived the negative things that happened in their lives changed. So they perceived them in a less negative way. And again, that was immediately after drinking the ayahuasca and then 6 months later. We found that those who had greater degrees of childhood trauma had greater decreases in how depressed they were, and that those who had, similar to our last study, had a more mystical experience, they also had a greater decrease in how depressed they were as well. In terms of the epigenetics, so we were looking at 3 different genes. And we found that one of the genes, one called the sigma-1 gene, actually had a change in something called methylation levels. So when genes are expressed, one of the ways that their expression can change is if they have something called a methyl group, which is a chemical basically stuck on the side to them. And we found that that had happened with this one gene. Now, sigma-1 is involved in lots of different things, but one of the things that's hypothesized to be involved in is traumatic memory recall. So that's super interesting. It's a really interesting finding, but we only had a sample size of around 50 for this. And so to be able to generalize the results, we need bigger samples. And so we're actually starting to do that now. We've got some more funding and we're continuing to look at the effect that ayahuasca could have on a genetic level. So I just wanted to raise this as well, just quickly as we're going through the research side of things. Is research into ayahuasca actually ethical? I think we need to be, checking ourselves the whole time as we're doing this. So the thoughts that came to my mind was that data is definitely required. So there are more and more people going out to drink ayahuasca all the time, and we have these claims all across the media, these amazing healing experiences that people have had, like mainly celebrities saying that it's changed their life. And then also, if you Google ayahuasca, you end up hearing famous cases. Like there's a guy from Bristol who died, unfortunately, a few years ago. And these are some of the top things that come up. And so I think it is important that we do this research to try and figure out, where the truth lies. Is there any truth to both of these things? We also can't deny that there's been a stagnation in treatments. So since the turn of the millennium, there's been barely any research into new ways, new drug treatments in mental health. And many of the new treatments that we do have are just they're alternative versions of the pre-existing drugs. So we definitely do need new treatments in psychiatry. We need to think about reciprocity as well. So this is giving back, which is a huge topic, and I'm sure we'll come onto it a bit later. But I've just put a few websites on there of organizations that are doing really good work. And it's not just giving money back. It can be giving back time, knowledge, experience. We personally support RAIN, which is Danny's charity, who many of you might know, Danny Nemu.
He was actually on our first ever event. He was at a panel discussion then. So yeah, fun little tidbit.
Fantastic. Cool. Okay. So earlier this year, I started working for an organization called the Psyche Institute, who are based in Melbourne. And this is a not-for-profit research center, and their aim is to develop psychedelic therapies as registered medical treatments. So what this is actually going to involve is looking at ayahuasca in a lab-based setting. And it's going to be using real ayahuasca. So it's not synthesizing chemicals, it's using a standardized form of ayahuasca in a randomized control trial format. And what that's going to do is open up the potential for ayahuasca to be prescribed by medical doctors in the future in a similar way, that we're seeing MDMA and psilocybin go down this route. Ayahuasca, this is basically starting ayahuasca down this path as well. So obviously this is an absolute minefield when it comes to ethical considerations. There are so many things there that for both me and my colleagues, we've been having to consider, such as, is this just cultural, or spiritual appropriation? Is it more than anything that the West has now come to this existential crisis, that we've taken the land and the resources of the indigenous, and that we're now starting to take the immaterial? I think Julian touched on this a little bit before. There are massive issues to do with oversimplification as well. I mean, and even, presenting the data that we've got from the jungle, that's one tiny part of what was going on, these decreases in depression that I've shown you. And it is very valid, but there are issues to do with trying to fit indigenous knowledge into a Western scientific framework. We're literally talking about trying to translate an ancient paradigm into a hospital setting, which has a whole host of problems that could come with it. And another thing that really kind of comes to my mind as well is, will this treatment actually work? And this one's particularly interesting because from a Western perspective, ayahuasca works in a similar way to many of the antidepressants that we have. Some of the chemicals affect receptors like the serotonin receptors. We get the things that Julian was referring to before, like a decrease in activity in the default mode network, and there's some defragmenting experience. And I don't think the indigenous curanderos, or at least the ones that I work with, don't disagree with that. But they would say that you're missing the point. The most important thing is the ceremony, and it's the connection to the spirit that causes the healing. And if you don't have that, then what do you have? You have a bunch of chemicals again. So these are all things that we need to be considering. So just some final thoughts on the medicalization of ayahuasca, and I guess psychedelics in general. So I think whether you agree with it or not, ayahuasca is spreading, or it's probably even more accurate to say it has spread. It's everywhere now. So I think that the question that we need to be asking realistically is, what can we do to try and make this spread ethical? And I think that we can do this. I think that we can do this if we're really listening, if we're trying to work together in partnership with indigenous communities, if we're giving back to them and supporting them rather than just extracting like we have done so many times in the past. I think that there is space to be able to respect these traditions whilst allowing for adaptation. But I think if we're going to do this, then we really need to be listening to the experts as we try to learn medicine from a different paradigm, and maybe even help with our current mental health crisis that we're facing in the West. Great. So welcome me any questions, and please feel free to drop me an email if you want to chat a bit further afterwards.
Hi, Simon. Can I ask a question? Sorry.
Yeah, please go for it.
First, I just want to say massive thank you. That was awesome. Slightly random one. Well, just initially, you mentioned at the start that ayahuasca was used for hunting and warfare. I was wondering what aspects of that what it was particularly involved in.
Yeah, lots of things. The hunting one is particularly interesting. So there are different ways of using ayahuasca. So you can just have just vine preparations. So there are many tribes. There's one tribe in Venezuela who still uses this. So they will chew large quantities of just the vine, which they say it gives them the eyes of the jaguar when they go out and when they're hunting. I've tried just vine preparations before, and I don't think it improved my ability to do anything, along those kind of lines. But I'm sure that they're using it in a way that I don't fully understand. And in terms of warfare, there's lots of good literature on this. So there's a book by Jeremy Narby called The Cosmic Serpent, which is a really nice introduction to things like magic darts, which are basically curses that people put on each other. And it's interesting as well. So when ayahuasca is used in different places all around the world, there are different ways that you can use it. So it's not just used in the Amazon rainforest, it's used in ayahuasca churches across Brazil. It's used in the mountains in Peru, even in the same country. And there, they don't really have this, or they have less of an emphasis on things like witchcraft. Whereas, at least where I was based in the jungle, there was still a huge emphasis on brujeria, like on these kind of almost like turf wars that are still ongoing. And this is, this is something that used to be much more rife kind of 100 years ago, but it's still there. And I found it particularly interesting because no one ever, well, I mean, people do obviously talk about it, but at least in the scientific investigation of ayahuasca, people kind of look over it. Nobody really kind of discusses it, which is something that I found particularly interesting because the tradition, it's almost like Western people don't really like that part of the tradition. And so as a result of that, we're kind of weaseling that bit out, and it's still there. But that's just because it doesn't fit into our perception of what psychedelics should be like. Does that mean that we shouldn't be embracing it, or at least acknowledging it?
Yeah, I see you completely. I also had one more, if that was all right, about the Sigma-1 gene. Were they the other two? Did you find the other two genes? Were they also kind of memory related? And if so, did you find any statistical significance in those as well?
No, so unfortunately, one of them we didn't get to do because we went into lockdown. So hopefully we're going to. The other one was BDNF, and there just wasn't a significant finding.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you so much.
Yeah, pleasure.
It's fascinating hearing about changes to genetics, because I think even Leary mentions it in, I can't remember what book, and at the time reading it, thinking that he has no idea what he's on about. How could psychedelics edit genetics? But that's fascinating to hear about, and I've never even thought about it from that perspective. So we'll take a question from Benjamin, please, and then Roy, if that's all right.
Why don't you just quickly say something on the...
Yeah, of course.
Sorry. I mean, just seeing as this discussion so heavily based around medicine and different cultures, one of the things, and the different ways of perceiving it, one of the things that I found most interesting is, so when I was trying to explain epigenetics to the shamans that we work with in the jungle, I was saying, so basically you can have genes that are kind of cranked up or cranked down, and everything in our environment changes them. But one of the big things that's been researched is trauma. So you find all these studies like from the Holocaust, where people who are in the Holocaust, they have certain genes in relation to their trauma responses that are cranked up. And these are then passed down various generations. So we see that in even the Holocaust survivors, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, they still have the genes that were cranked up as a result of the Holocaust activated within them. And in mice studies, we see that this lasts for about 14 generations, but we don't know how long that is in humans, but basically really long time before you kind of revert back to normal. And when I described this to the shamans, they were like, oh, of course, yeah, like cleaning ancestral lines. And they just thought of it from this completely different point of view. And it was this super cool intersection of two different paradigms that are really nicely, I'm sure there are kind of problems with this analogy, but I like that intersection between the shamanic indigenous point of view and Western science. And I find it really exciting when these parallels just kind of pop out. It's really nice to see, instead of there being a clash between the worlds, them working in synergy.
Kind of these sort of archetypal understandings seems to almost underlay both of them, but it's just approaching it from one more materialist angle and one more kind of familial based one. That's fascinating. Great. We'll take that question from Benjamin Grubenberg, if you're still...
That's me.
Great.
Hi. So first of all, Simon, thank you for the talk. It's really, really interesting. Psychology student here. So just welcome the critiques, not critiques, but questions as well. So when doing the personality measure, how did you make sure that nothing was lost in translation? So obviously the personality measures are natively in English, and I'm guessing your subjects weren't tested in English. So how do you make sure like all of the words and the semantic ideas were translated properly over? And then secondly, how do you also ensure that there were no demand characteristics just because you were like a researcher from the West? Like, how did you maintain a good relationship with all the subjects?
So because it was at a retreat center, it was a Western population.
Oh, okay, fine.
And in order to maintain a good relationship, I was on the retreats with them, not drinking ayahuasca, but just kind of, with the participants as they were going through the experience, doing the semi-structured interviews and stuff like that.
Okay, fine. Yeah, thank you. Maybe I should just listen a bit better.
Thanks. Could Rye, you want to ask a question next?
I'm going to target this towards Julian, but then I want Simon's response afterwards. With psychedelic research and other psychoactive compounds being researched currently, there seems to be a trend within the research of psychoactive compounds into looking for compounds which do not have the psychoactive effects, but still target the same sort of serotonergic based systems without the altered states of consciousness. I want to ask both of you what degree you find this approach valuable. Is it misguided? Is it a remnant of prohibitionist methodology? Or is it a type of medical inquiry which will be valuable for people who can't withstand altered states of consciousness? So Julian first.
It's a very good question. I suspect all of the above. So you know, I can imagine that part of the rationale behind that is, you know, tripping is all too weird, and therefore there are some people who might benefit from these medicines who might not be able to easily undergo that kind of experience. I mean, we know, you know, we can talk about things like you know, the creation of novel materials that might not have certain of the kind of subjective aspects of psychedelics. I don't know enough about the field and about the chemistry that's being explored. I would be interested to, you know, I suspect personally that what we describe in one register as being, you know, the kind of neuroplasticity, the downregulation, the default mode network, and so forth, all of those things subjectively are what we experience as tripping. Yeah, so that what we have happening at a sort of the level of our sort of neuroanatomy, the subjective experience of that is the journey. And I would suggest that the journey, and then this is maybe one of the things that Simon's pointing to about this idea of the ceremony, like the journey process in and of itself. That's the fundamental kind of process, and you can actually you know, get this kind of journey process to happen with any number of different activities that don't necessarily involve particular chemistry from an exogenous point of view, you know, with breath work and kind of protracted periods of darkness and all kinds of different ways that obviously effectively have a similar kind of neurological effect, but aren't substances that we're putting inside our bodies. So you know, all human life is here. As these medicines come into the modern medical discourse, you know, our medical models in the West, very, very good from the point of view of battlefield medicine. You know, we do it incredibly well. If I want my heart restarted or my arm pinned back on after it's been wrenched away from its socket, I want to be in a conventional hospital by and large. But for those kind of like, you know, those sort of chronic conditions, which are actually in some respects just symptoms of a wider sociological difficulty that we have being with each other and being with the biosphere, that type of medicine, which is a sort of the, you know, with the work that Simon's doing, with other practitioners are doing, finding about how, you know, how Western medicine can meet this, I like to think that those will change Western medicine as well as those techniques and approaches go in. If nothing else, because it stops there being, you know, it's no longer just like a 5-minute, 10-minute you know, consultation with your GP, or even an hour's talk therapy with, you know, your counselor. It's now someone sitting with you for 8 hours, 2 people while you're on MDMA, having seen you through all the kind of the preparatory sessions and then all the sessions afterwards. So, you know, as I think medicine will change, and then perhaps we might see people being more comfortable with the idea of the subjective effects. You know, we start to say, well, actually, it's the subjective effects is the thing we want. You know, it's not actually just the changes in the amount of serotonin that's sloshing around in the system. You know, we've got medications that can already do that quite successfully, can alter those things, and they also, of course, have their benefits. So I like to think that some of this will resolve itself, or at least it will develop as contemporary Western medicine meets these other kind of healing modalities and is itself changed by those things. So I guess that sort of partly answers the question. Right, is that all right?
Thank you, Julian. Simon, would you like to give your answer to that?
Yeah,
yeah, great.
I mean, I think you know, there are some people that are quite against this and have kind of spoken out about it being just kind of absurd. I know that Rick Doblin doesn't really like the idea, like, from MAPS, and which I do totally get, but at the same time, I kind of think if we're doing research into new ways of treating mental health problems, you know, like, why not? Like, yeah, like, look at it. Let's look at it. If it helps people, fantastic. You know, go for it. We can. It's not gonna mean that we have less psychedelic medicine if we have some that don't give you psychedelic effects. There's enough room for all of these kind of treatments, and it will probably help some people that wouldn't get treatment. That wouldn't get treatment from psychedelics otherwise. So that's great. But at the same time, I don't think it's going to be nearly as good. You know, I think that the effects won't be as good. I think that my take on it is that a lot of the therapeutic benefit comes from going through that psychedelic process. Now, whether you believe that's purely chemical, whether you believe that's spiritual, I don't think it really matters. But I think if you take that away, you'll have a truncated version of the original treatment, which is probably going to be less effective. Much in the same way that I would imagine that the results that we'll get from the ayahuasca randomized control trials won't be as good as the results that we get from the ayahuasca in the jungle, because you're taking away the shamans, you're taking away bits of it. Ayahuasca, the actual brew without the shamans, I'm sure will still be great. It will still be fantastic, but you're taking away one of the core elements. And I think that if you're taking away the psychedelic effects of these chemicals, you're taking away yet another core element. And so you're truncating it even further, but I don't think there's necessarily anything wrong with that.
It's a tricky situation, isn't it? Because I can certainly think of some people, for example, I don't know, someone who wanted to deal with their trauma, but might have a predisposition towards psychosis or a kind of schizoid personality type. I can see how for those people, not actually tripping could be a real fantastic thing if it would still have those curative impacts. But yeah, I mean, I personally wouldn't be interested, I suppose. And I guess also, I wonder if there are similar criticisms to aim towards microdosing. Some people feel similar about microdosing.
I was just about to say that.
Oh, yeah, great, fantastic.
Yeah. I mean, you know, I think, as I understand it, both from Torsten Passey's book and also from more kind of recent research, microdosing does work, and it's an incredibly good placebo way of working with psychedelics. There may well be, I mean, we know, for example, with, I don't know, the effects that aspirin has, you know, we only really saw those effects at very, very large sample sizes. And we're dealing with like N equals, you know, not very much. And there's been a recent sort of self-blinding study that was done where, again, the evidence that came back was, you know, this is, we say no better than the placebo, but, you know, particularly as somebody who's interested in the capacity of the imagination to change the, you know, inner and outer reality, or whatever we want to call these things. I like that. I mean, it's also what Simon was pointing out with taking the ayahuasca out of the kind of the ritualized setting. And of course, there are a number of ways of ritualizing it, some of which are the kind of the part of those entheogenic traditions, and some of which are more kind of contemporary or reimagined or whatever. But if we just take these things away, we're left just with a chemical or just with a microdose or whatever, then that's one thing. But if we can wrap these around with this thing that we normally have to correct against in drug trials for very good reasons, the placebo effect, and we say, well, actually, let's actively embrace this, you know, using all the kind of different modalities and the different sort of ways that we can understand this phenomena, then we can still make use of the existing psychedelic substances in a way that doesn't, you know, cause a problem from the point of view of tripping, may conceivably have some kind of effect that we would notice at a large sample size, but also we know that is, you know, not problematic for most people, and it does seem to be beneficial, but probably at the same level as placebo. So we already, in a sense, have this technology out there. It's called, and as you rightly say, it's called microdosing.
And placebo is just fascinating. I'm saying just placebo, just to reiterate your point, placebo is so powerful. I mean, I think I even remember reading some studies completely different in the realm of physical science, but of placebo was one of the forms of treatment for athlete's foot. And this actually had a note, which, sorry to bring up athlete's foot, but that to me is fascinating. Did anyone did I just freeze there? Did that still?
Yeah, it was a little, but we got the gist of it.
We got the gist of it.
Yeah.
Well, the fact that placebo can actually have such a powerful physical manifestation to me is just really incredibly interesting. And similarly with nocebo, which I think is more kind of when it's poisonous or negative, that I've read about these people, often policemen or whatever else, collapsing at the sight of fentanyl, because they've read that fentanyl is something which, you know, even if you touch it, you get it in your skin. If you go near it, you'll just die. And so these people actually literally collapse and kind of almost confirm these myths that aren't grounded in reality about how these substances work. And that to me is fascinating. And just one brief point about the importance of ritual. I think there's a lot to be said about the powerful psychological impacts purely of that traditional practice, even without the substance. I can think back to really kind of, in a sense, what was my first trip was when I was 12 and I experienced a gong bath. And the gong bath had all these incredible visions and all this stuff. It was really personal.
Alex, your connection's quite shaky. I'm assuming if anyone else probably not getting a lot of that.
Okay.
It's back now.
Well, never mind.
It's back now. It's back now. But yeah,
it's back now. What was the last thing you heard? I don't want to.
That you said your first trip was when you were 12.
Yeah. Oh no, that's when it stopped. Oh no, that's not good. It was a gong bath, to be clear. It wasn't an LSD trip. It's quite funny that it froze there. And I had all these incredible visions and sort of kind of almost this hallucinatory apparitions. It was quite difficult at the time. And I was always, I think at the time, considered quite skeptical of all that sort of stuff. And so it's fascinating the importance of traditional and ritual in this direct psychological impact, which, much like placebo, whether or not there's anything there's something happening mentally, even if we can't understand it biochemically. And that to me is fascinating. Barlin, if you'd like to ask a question, that's okay. We've got time for that.
Yeah, first off, I just want to thank both the speakers. We had some really interesting thoughts, and I really appreciate your ideas. I have loads of questions, but I try to keep it brief. First off, I think this is aimed towards Simon, and it's about like academic research on psychedelics and like whether or not it is a pro or a con if somebody has tried psychedelics when doing academic research, because I've seen arguments for both ends of the spectrum. Like you're obviously somewhat biased if you're already tried these substances, but on the other hand, you have to know what you're looking for when researching these substances. So what's your take on this?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I don't think there's a right or a wrong answer. I think this is just my own personal view, but I think during the trials, so I'm one of the study doctors, so it less applies to me, but I guess it still does kind of apply to me. But as the therapists who are with the participants when they're going through the experience, I think it would be beneficial to have an idea of what that feels like. But I also don't think that has to be through taking a psychedelic. I mean, you can get that experience, like Alex just said, from going to a gong bath, or doing holotropic breath work. And so rather than you know, when we design these studies, rather than saying you have to have drank ayahuasca, you know, X many times, you know, at least I kind of recommend experience an altered state of consciousness, which could well be, you know, breath work, totally fine, or gong bath, just something so that you have an idea of where the participant is when they're going through the experience. But it's a tricky one because many people kind of say, yeah, you should know what it feels like in order to be under the influence of whatever, if you're prescribing it as the study doctor. But then as a psychiatrist, that kind of opens up, you know, should I experience what it's like to be under clozapine antipsychotic, or, you know, like all of these different things. So I think, for me personally, I think it is beneficial to have experience with that, but it doesn't necessarily have to be a psychedelic. It can be an altered state.
Right, thank you. And my other question to you is, what particularly drew you towards ayahuasca? Why did you select this substance to do research on?
Yeah, so I've done research into other things as well, like the psilocybin and a bit of ketamine stuff and DMT. But for me, ayahuasca, I just found ayahuasca so much more interesting. Like I was just always felt incredibly drawn to it with my own personal experiences as well. And the thing that drew me to it so much was that it was the intersection with so many different areas, but especially mysticism. You know, this idea that you could have a form of medicine that interacted with potentially with the spirit world, the role of ceremony, the role of music, all of these things, basically everything that I found fascinating mixed into one thing. I just couldn't believe it. And and I guess just through my own journey with ayahuasca, those doors have flown open with the research as other ones have closed. So I followed that. So I'd say it was the multidisciplinary, holistic nature of ayahuasca, as opposed to other things. I think you can get that with other psychedelics as well, but with ayahuasca, it's blatantly obvious, which also makes it really difficult to study, but that's kind of part of the fun. Yeah.
Great, thank you very much.
And was that question, did you have a question for Julian as well, did you say, or no, that was just for...
Yeah, I can go.
No, I invented that in my head. Well, I think we're probably coming towards the end now. Is that Julian, Simon? I'll keep you on forever. What do we think? I think that's all the questions asked. Anything we have left to say? Any kind of closing remarks, as it were, or is it? I think it's time to go, isn't it? Really. Well, I just want to say thank you so much for taking some of your time to give this talk. This has been really, really interesting. I didn't think that we were going to come to a definitive conclusion of what psychedelics are or will be, or that we were going to somehow come up with this description, which because I think some of the beauty of psychedelics is that even the definition sort of exceeds. It's very hard to put into words, but I guess that's my point. It's ineffable. And I feel even the definition, something that's consciousness expanding or consciousness modulating, it's a very complicated theme, but a very interesting one. So thank you very much I just think Rye has got a point. Yeah, one brief point about fentanyl. It's a way to end, I suppose. That it's a drug just like other drugs and can be used correctly. No, I think that's a really valid point. I want to be clear. My point was more just that it's interesting that people have these misconceptions which lead them to react terribly to substances. But yeah, indeed, they're all drugs. Well, most drugs seem to have their own recognizable medical uses and can be used appropriately in the right way. I think that's important to say. There was no snobbery against one particular class of opioids and a class of drugs, rather. Dr. Carl Hart's interest in that. But anyway, thank you very much. It's been really, really interesting. Our next event will be at the Psychedelic Cafe on ecological sustainability. That will be announced in due course. So there's nothing left to say. Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your evening, guys.
Thank you very much for coming to speak to us. Thank you very much, Alex, for organising this as well.
Thank you so much, Benjamin.
Yeah. Thank you, Alex. Thank you, everyone. Really appreciate it. Good to see you all.
Great.
Thank you, Julian and Simon. It was great.